A broken-down horse doctor and a woman bearing shame's scarlet letter discover that sometimes the most profound healing happens between two people the world has already written off as beyond saving. When vengeful churchmen arrive to destroy the fragile sanctuary they've built together on the Kansas frontier, can a horseman's damaged heart prove strong enough to shelter the family that saved his soul? A gunshot cracked across the Kansas prairie, sending a flock of crows into the blazing August sky. But Mercy Blackwood didn't flinch. She'd heard worse sounds than that in the past 3 months. The dust from the departing wagon settled around her worn boots as she stood alone on the endless dirt road, holding her sick boy close to her chest. "Mama, I'm hot," little Benjamin whispered, his small body burning with fever despite the willow bark tea she'd given him that morning. His blonde hair stuck to his sweaty forehead, and his usually bright blue eyes looked dull and tired. The year was 1867, and the Kansas Territory stretched out like a golden ocean in every direction. Nothing but grass and sky and the promise of more hardship ahead. Mercy adjusted the heavy leather bag on her shoulder. Everything she owned in the world fit inside that one satchel. Her other arm held Benjamin, who felt lighter each day as the sickness took its toll. Behind them, the town of Cedar Falls had already forgotten they existed. 3 days ago, she'd been packing their few belongings while neighbors whispered on their front porches. The church ladies had made their decision with tight lips and cold eyes. A woman who'd had a baby without a husband didn't belong in their Christian community, no matter how hard she worked or how sweetly she sang in the choir. "Where are we going, Mama?" Benjamin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "West, baby. Always west." She'd been telling him that for weeks now, ever since they'd left Missouri. Before that, it had been Illinois. Before that, Ohio. Each town had promised a fresh start, but shame traveled faster than hope on the frontier. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning her long brown dress into a personal oven. Sweat dripped down her back as she started walking, one boot in front of the other, toward whatever lay ahead. The road stretched out like a ribbon of pain, disappearing into heat waves that made the horizon dance. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, hunting for prey in the tall grass. Mercy envied its freedom. Nothing judged a hawk for doing what it needed to survive. She'd been judged for loving the wrong man, for believing his promises, for carrying his child when he decided he preferred the comfort of his rich wife back east. Benjamin's breathing grew labored as they walked. Each step jarred his small frame, making him whimper softly. Mercy's own stomach cramped with hunger. They'd eaten the last of their bread that morning, and her coins wouldn't stretch to another meal. But she kept walking because stopping meant giving up, and she'd promised herself she'd never do that again. The prairie grass whispered secrets as the wind moved through it. Sometimes she heard voices in that sound. Her mother's disappointed sigh, her father's angry shouts, the preacher's condemning words. Other times she heard Benjamin's laughter from before he got sick, back when the world still felt safe enough for little boys to laugh. A mile passed, then another. Her feet began to blister inside her boots, but she welcomed the pain. Physical hurt was easier to bear than the constant ache in her chest where hope used to live. At least blisters healed eventually. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into liquid fire. Benjamin's fever spiked, making him mumble words that didn't make sense. Mercy pressed her lips to his forehead. He was burning up like a coal from the stove. She needed to find water, shade, medicine. She needed to find help from someone who wouldn't ask questions about rings and husbands and proper Christian behavior. Far ahead, a line of dark green marked where trees grew near water. Cottonwoods, probably, clustering around a creek or river. Water meant life on the prairie, and life meant maybe her boy would see another sunset. A strange sound reached her ears, the rhythmic clip-clop of horse hooves, but uneven, like the animal was hurt. She looked up from Benjamin's flushed face to see a lone rider approaching from the trees, leading his horse instead of riding it. Even from a distance, she could tell something was wrong with the way the man moved. Her hand went to the small knife at her belt. A woman alone with a sick child made an easy target for men with bad intentions. But desperation had taught her to be careful while still staying open to possibility. Sometimes help came from unexpected places. The rider drew closer, his figure becoming clearer through the shimmering heat. Tall but stooped, with dark hair under a worn hat. His horse favored its left front leg, and the man himself walked with a pronounced limp. Two broken creatures making their way across the unforgiving landscape. "Please," she whispered to the endless sky, "let this be someone who still remembers kindness. Ma'am, you look like you could use some water." The voice belonged to a man who'd clearly seen his share of trouble. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who'd spent years under the harsh prairie sun, and his gray eyes held the careful kindness of someone who knew what it felt like to be judged. His clothes were clean but patched, his boots worn but serviceable. Mercy tightened her grip on Benjamin, every muscle in her body ready to run despite her exhaustion. "We're managing just fine, thank you." "I'm sure you are." The stranger's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "But managing and thriving are two different things. And that boy of yours is burning up with fever." He stopped about 10 feet away, giving her space to decide whether he was friend or threat. His horse, a sturdy bay mare with intelligent eyes, nickered softly and nuzzled his shoulder. The gentle interaction told Mercy more about the man's character than any words could. "Name's Jeremiah Cole," he said, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair touched with gray at the temples. "And before you ask, yes, I'm the one they whisper about in town. The doctor who lost his way and found himself out here in the middle of nowhere." "A doctor?" Mercy's heart leaped with hope before caution pulled it back down. "If you're truly a doctor, then you know a sick child needs more than conversation. He needs willow bark tea for the fever, cool water to bring his temperature down, and a place to rest while his body fights whatever's got hold of him." Jeremiah's eyes stayed on Benjamin's flushed face. "Creek's just ahead through those trees. Good water, plenty of shade, and I've got medical supplies back at my place." "Your place?" Mercy stepped back, her free hand moving to the knife at her belt. She'd heard stories about men who preyed on desperate women, offering help that came with a price no decent woman would pay. Jeremiah noticed the movement and held up both hands, showing empty palms. "My homestead's about 2 miles north of the creek. Nothing fancy. Just a cabin, a barn, and more loneliness than any one person ought to carry. But it's got a roof that doesn't leak and a well that runs clean." Something in his voice made her look closer. This wasn't a man making false promises or hiding dark intentions. This was someone who understood what it meant to be cast out, to wander from place to place looking for somewhere that felt like home. "I can pay," she said quickly. "Not much, but I'm not asking for charity." "Didn't figure you were." Jeremiah settled his hat back on his head. Woman walking alone with a sick child, carrying everything she owns in one bag. That's not someone who gives up easy or takes handouts without earning them. They studied each other in the blazing heat, two broken people trying to decide if trust was possible. Benjamin stirred in her arms, mumbling feverish words that made no sense. The sound seemed to decide something in Jeremiah's expression. "Tell you what," he said, starting toward the trees with his limping horse. "Come to the creek. Get the boy cooled down and hydrated. After that, you can decide what comes next." "Fair enough." Mercy found herself following, drawn by the promise of water and the stranger's matter-of-fact kindness. As they walked, she noticed how gently he handled his injured horse, how he automatically slowed his pace to match hers, how his eyes kept checking on Benjamin without being obvious about it. "What happened to your horse?" she asked, needing to fill the silence with something safer than her own desperate thoughts. "Stepped in a prairie dog hole about a mile back. Nothing broken, but she'll need rest before she's ready to carry weight again." He patted the mare's neck. "Good thing I wasn't in a hurry to get anywhere. Were you in town?" "Cedar Falls." Jeremiah's expression darkened slightly. "Stopped by the general store for supplies. Heard some interesting conversation about a woman and child who'd been asked to leave." Heat that had nothing to do with the sun crept up Mercy's neck. "People talk. They do indeed. Usually about things that aren't any of their business." His voice carried a bitter edge that suggested personal experience with gossip and judgment. Funny how the same folks who preach about Christian charity on Sunday morning can be so quick to cast stones the rest of the week. They reached the creek, a ribbon of clear water winding between cottonwood trees that offered blessed shade. Jeremiah helped her settle Benjamin in a cool spot while she dipped her handkerchief in the stream and began bathing the child's fevered face. "The boy's got a strong pulse," Jeremiah observed, kneeling beside them with practiced ease despite his damaged leg. "Fever's high but not dangerous yet." "How long has he been sick?" 3 days. "Started right before we—" She caught herself before saying, "before we were forced to leave." "Before you decided to move on," Jeremiah finished diplomatically. His hands moved over Benjamin with professional competence, checking for swollen glands, listening to his breathing, testing his reflexes. "Good news is, this feels like a common childhood ailment. Bad news is, he needs proper care and time to recover." Benjamin's eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on the stranger's face. "Who are you?" he whispered. "I'm a friend of your mama's," Jeremiah said gently. "What's your name, son?" "Benjamin. Benjamin Blackwood." The child's voice was stronger now that cool water had touched his lips. "Well, Benjamin Blackwood, you've got yourself a fine name and a mama who'd walk through fire for you." Jeremiah smiled, and for the first time, Mercy saw past the weathered exterior to the man he might have been before life had worn him down. "How would you like to see where I live? It's got chickens and a garden and the best well water in Kansas." Benjamin looked to his mother with eyes that held too much understanding for a 2-year-old. Somehow, he'd learned to read the signs of another fresh start, another leap into the unknown. But what choice did they have? The chickens scattered like feathered explosions when Jeremiah's limping horse finally reached his homestead. Mercy had expected something rough and temporary, the kind of shelter that spoke of a man just passing through. Instead, she found herself looking at a place that whispered of permanence. Weathered but solid, functional in the way that spoke of careful planning and patient work. "It's not much to look at," Jeremiah said, helping her down from the horse where she'd ridden the last half-mile with Benjamin in her arms. "But the walls are thick, the roof keeps out the rain, and there's room for more than just one broken-down doctor." The cabin sat low against the prairie like it had grown there naturally. A vegetable garden stretched along the south side, rows of beans and corn fighting a losing battle against the summer heat. A small barn leaned companionably against a chicken coop that had clearly seen better years, while a windmill creaked steadily in the afternoon breeze. Benjamin stirred as they approached the front door, his fever-bright eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Mama, are those real chickens?" "Real as rain," Jeremiah confirmed, fishing a key from his pocket. "Got 6 hens and a rooster who thinks he runs the whole territory. You can meet them properly once you're feeling better." Inside, the cabin surprised Mercy again. Clean floors, windows that actually let in light, furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. Books lined one wall, more books than she'd seen outside a school. A stone fireplace dominated the far end, while a kitchen area occupied the space near the door. "You can put the boy in there," Jeremiah said, nodding toward a small bedroom off the main room. "It's cooler, and he'll rest better away from the noise." But Mercy hesitated at the threshold, suddenly aware of what she was doing. Taking help from a strange man, entering his home, accepting kindness that might come with expectations she wasn't prepared to meet. Her last bitter experience with trusting men had taught her caution. Jeremiah seemed to read her thoughts. "There's a lock on the bedroom door," he said quietly. "Keys on the inside. You use it if it makes you feel safer." The simple acknowledgement of her fears, offered without judgment or explanation, nearly undid her careful composure. When had anyone last thought about making her feel safe? She settled Benjamin on the narrow bed, noting how the sheets smelled of sunshine and soap rather than the mustiness she'd expected. Through the small window, she could see the garden where tomato plants drooped in the heat despite careful watering. "I can work," she said when she returned to the main room, finding Jeremiah at the kitchen table grinding something in a small mortar. "I'm not afraid of hard labor, and I know my way around a garden." "Figured you might." He didn't look up from his work. "This time of year, Keeping things alive is a full-time job. Garden's been losing ground to the grasshoppers, and I'm not as spry as I used to be. Mercy watched his hands as he worked, steady despite whatever injury had left him walking with that pronounced limp. The grinding motion was practiced, professional. You really are a doctor. Was. Past tense. His mouth tightened. Now I'm just a man who remembers some useful things about healing. What happened? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Jeremiah's hands stilled. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down the pestle and looked at her directly. Same thing that happens to most folks who fall from grace. Made some bad choices. Hurt people I was supposed to help. Lost everything that mattered. But you still help people. The way you examined Benjamin, the medical supplies. Helping people and being trusted to help people are different things. He resumed grinding, the sound filling the awkward silence. This is for the boy's fever. Willow bark and a few other things that'll bring his temperature down. She wanted to press for more details, to understand what had brought this obviously educated man to a lonely homestead in the middle of nowhere. But she recognized the careful way he'd shared just enough to answer her question without revealing anything that mattered. The bedroom has everything you need, he continued. Fresh water in the pitcher, clean linens. There's a bolt on the door if you want privacy. Where will you sleep? Barn's comfortable enough. Been sleeping out there most nights anyway, cooler than the house this time of year. Mercy studied his profile, trying to read the truth beneath his careful politeness. Everything about this situation felt too good to be real. Men didn't offer shelter to strange women without expecting something in return. Especially not women carrying the kind of shame that followed her like a shadow. But Benjamin coughed from the bedroom, a harsh sound that reminded her she didn't have the luxury of endless suspicion. Her son needed medicine, rest, and safety. This man was offering all three. I can cook, she said finally. Clean, mend clothes, tend the garden. I earn my keep. Never doubted it. Jeremiah poured hot water over the ground herbs, creating a tea that smelled bitter but promising. Woman who's walked as far as you have with a sick child isn't someone who takes the easy path. How do you know how far we've walked? Dust on your skirts is Kansas dust, but the wear on your boots tells a longer story. That bag of yours has been packed and unpacked more times than most folks manage in a lifetime. He strained the tea into a cup. Takes one wanderer to recognize another. As evening approached, Mercy found herself moving through domestic routines that felt both foreign and familiar. She prepared a simple supper from supplies in Jeremiah's well-stocked pantry while he tended his animals. Benjamin's fever broke just after sunset, leaving him weak but clear-eyed for the first time in days. The man with the hurt leg is nice, Benjamin observed as she helped him sip the medicinal tea. He talks to me like I'm big. Yes, he does. Mercy smoothed her son's damp hair. But remember, we're just visiting. We won't be staying long. But even as she said the words, she found herself wondering if they were true. Through the window, she could see Jeremiah feeding his chickens with patient care, talking to them like old friends. The garden called to her with its obvious need for attention. The house felt more like home than anywhere they'd been in months. For the first time since leaving Cedar Falls, Mercy allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to stop running. Thunder rolled across the prairie like God clearing his throat, and Mercy woke to the sound of frantic clucking from the chicken coop. Lightning split the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating sheets of rain that hammered the cabin's roof with increasing fury. She'd been at Jeremiah's homestead for 2 weeks now, long enough to know that prairie storms didn't announce themselves politely. Mama, what's that noise? Benjamin sat up in the narrow bed they shared, his eyes wide with the particular alarm that came from being awakened by nature's violence. Just a storm, baby. Go back to sleep. But Mercy was already reaching for her dress, knowing from experience that storms on the frontier meant all hands working to save whatever could be saved. Through the bedroom window, she could see Jeremiah's lantern bobbing toward the barn, his limping figure barely visible through the driving rain. The man had been nothing but respectful during their stay, sleeping in the barn as promised, treating her with careful courtesy, never once making her feel uncomfortable or obligated beyond the work she insisted on doing. But storms had a way of breaking down the polite boundaries that people built between themselves. She dressed quickly and stepped into the main room, where rain was already finding its way through a loose board near the window. The sound was deafening. Not just falling water, but the wind that drove it, howling across the prairie like something wild and angry. The front door burst open, bringing with it a gust of wind and rain that scattered papers from Jeremiah's desk. He stumbled inside, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. "Roof's got a weak spot over the barn," he called over the storm's roar. "Need to get the animals secured before the whole structure comes down." Mercy was already tying on her apron. "What can I do? Can you handle chickens? They're half crazy with fear, but they need to be moved to the root cellar before they hurt themselves." Together they plunged back into the storm, Mercy's skirts immediately soaked and clinging to her legs. The wind tried to knock her sideways, but she fought her way toward the panicked sounds coming from the chicken coop. Lightning revealed a scene of feathered chaos. 6 hens and a rooster in full panic, flapping and screeching as rain poured through gaps in the old roof. "Come on, ladies," Mercy called, trying to sound calmer than she felt. "Let's get you somewhere dry." Catching wet, frightened chickens turned out to be like trying to capture small, slippery storms. They squawked indignantly as she gathered them 2 at a time, racing through the rain to the root cellar behind the house. By the 4th trip, she was laughing despite the chaos. There was something absurdly wonderful about being useful in a crisis, about working alongside someone who trusted her competence without question. The barn roof chose that moment to give way with a sound like the world cracking open. Mercy watched a section of wooden shingles sail past the chicken coop, carried by wind that seemed determined to relocate everything that wasn't nailed down twice. "Jeremiah," she called, but the storm swallowed her voice. She found him in the barn, standing hip-deep in muddy water, trying to calm his horse while rain poured through the damaged roof. His usually neat hair hung in his eyes, and his clothes were plastered to his frame, but his hands remained steady as he worked with the frightened animal. "Can't get her to the house," he shouted over the noise. "Too spooked to move, and the lightnings got her terrified." Mercy waded into the flooded barn, ignoring the cold water that immediately soaked through her boots. The horse's eyes rolled white with fear, but she approached slowly, humming a tune her father had taught her years ago for calming anxious animals. "Easy, girl. Easy now." She let the mare catch her scent before reaching out to stroke the trembling neck. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just going to wait this out together." Something in her voice seemed to reach the animal. The horse's breathing slowed, her muscles relaxing slightly under Mercy's gentle touch. Jeremiah watched in amazement as his normally skittish mare allowed herself to be led toward the house. They spent the worst of the storm in the cabin's main room. 3 humans, 1 horse, 6 chickens, and a rooster who seemed personally offended by the weather. Benjamin sat cross-legged on the floor, absolutely delighted by the indoor menagerie, while Mercy and Jeremiah worked to patch the worst leaks with whatever materials they could find. "You're good with animals," Jeremiah observed as his horse finally settled in the corner, content to munch hay from a bucket. "Natural touch. My father raised horses before." She caught herself. Before her disgrace had cost him his reputation and his business. "Before I left home. Must have been hard, leaving family behind." Mercy concentrated on wringing water from a soaked towel, avoiding his too perceptive gaze. "Sometimes leaving is the kindest thing you can do for people you love." The words hung between them, weighted with meanings neither was ready to explore. Outside, the storm began to exhaust itself, the furious downpour settling into steady rain that would soak the thirsty prairie for hours. "Roof's going to need major repairs," Jeremiah said, surveying the water damage. "Probably take me the better part of a week to fix it properly." "I can help with that too." The offer came automatically, born of 2 weeks of finding satisfaction in shared work. "I'm handy with a hammer, and I'm not afraid of heights." Mercy, her name on his lips, stopped her mid-sentence. "Why are you really here?" The question she'd been dreading, asked with the gentle directness that seemed to be his way. She looked at Benjamin, now curled up asleep between two chickens, his face peaceful in the lamplight. At the horse standing quietly in what should have been a human living space. At the man who'd opened his home to strangers without asking for explanations or guarantees. Because, she said finally, this is the first place in 3 years that's felt like it might be home. The admission surprised them both. Jeremiah's expression softened, while Mercy felt something inside her chest. Something that had been clenched tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Finally begin to relax. Outside, the storm moved on toward the east, leaving behind the sweet smell of rain-washed earth and the promise of a new day. Inside, 3 lost souls discovered that sometimes the most profound shelter came not from buildings, but from the simple human decision to make room for each other's brokenness. A cloud of dust on the horizon meant only one thing on the Kansas prairie. Riders approaching fast, and fast usually meant trouble. Mercy spotted them first while hanging laundry on the line behind Jeremiah's cabin, the white sheets snapping like flags in the morning breeze. Her hands froze on the clothespins as she counted 3 horses, their riders pushing hard across the grassland. "Jeremiah!" she called, her voice carrying the sharp edge of alarm that came from months of looking over her shoulder. "Company coming." He emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing storm damage, his hammer still in his good hand. One look at the approaching dust cloud made his expression harden into something Mercy had never seen before. Not the gentle man who'd bandaged Benjamin's scraped knee yesterday, but someone who understood exactly what kind of trouble rode in groups of 3. "Get Benjamin inside," he said quietly. "Lock the bedroom door and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Who are they? The kind of men who don't ride that hard unless they're chasing something. His eyes met hers with steady intensity. Or someone. Mercy's stomach dropped. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had felt it lurking at the edges of every peaceful day spent in Jeremiah's quiet sanctuary. The past had a way of hunting down people who tried to escape it, especially women who dared to find happiness outside society's narrow rules. She scooped Benjamin from where he'd been playing with the chickens, ignoring his protests as she carried him toward the house. Through the kitchen window, she watched the riders grow larger, their forms resolving into the shapes of men in Sunday clothes, the kind of formal dress that meant official business or self-righteous mission work. "Mama, why are we hiding?" Benjamin whispered as she settled him on the bed and turned the key in the lock. "We're not hiding, baby. We're just being careful." But her hands shook as she smoothed his hair, and she could hear her own fear in the way her voice went high and tight. Through the thin walls, she heard boots on the front porch, the creak of leather as men dismounted. Then voices, Jeremiah's calm and steady, another that made ice form in her chest despite the summer heat. "Good morning, Jeremiah. Heard you've been harboring some interesting guests." Reverend Marcus Whitfield, the man who'd married her parents 25 years ago, who'd baptized her as a baby, who delivered the sermon about fallen women that had driven her from the only home she'd ever known. His voice carried the particular brand of authority that came from believing God spoke directly through your mouth. "Reverend." Jeremiah's tone revealed nothing. "Long way to ride for a social call." "Indeed, though I suppose you know why we're here." Mercy pressed her ear to the door, her heart hammering so hard she was sure the men outside could hear it. Benjamin watched her with eyes too old for his 3 years, already learning to read the signs that meant they'd have to run again. "Can't say I do," Jeremiah replied. "But you're welcome to enlighten me. Don't play games, Cole. We know you've got Mercy Blackwood and her bastard child. The woman's caused enough scandal in 3 counties. Time for her to face the consequences of her choices." The word hit like a physical blow. Bastard. Applied to her sweet boy who'd never hurt anyone, who made friends with chickens and asked endless questions about how flowers grew. Mercy bit down hard on her knuckle to keep from crying out. "Interesting way to talk about a child," Jeremiah said, and something in his voice had gone cold as winter water. "Especially for a man of God. The child is innocent of his mother's sins, which is exactly why he needs to be removed from her corrupting influence. We found a good Christian family willing to take him in, raise him properly. And the woman? There's a position available with the Sisters of Mercy in St. Louis. Hard work and prayer might yet save her soul, though I have my doubts. Mercy's legs gave out, dropping her to the floor beside the bed where Benjamin sat watching with growing alarm. They wanted to take her son, split up the only family she had left, send her to scrub floors in a convent while strangers raised the boy she'd carried for 9 months and loved for 3 years. Benjamin stays with his mother, Jeremiah said firmly. Both of them stay right here, where they're wanted and cared for. You have no legal claim to either of them. Mercy Blackwood is a ward of the church until she proves herself capable of Christian behavior. Her son needs proper guidance from people who understand moral responsibility. Moral responsibility. Jeremiah repeated the words like he was tasting something bitter. That's rich, coming from men who'd tear a child from his mother's arms in the name of Christian charity. The conversation continued, but Mercy could barely focus on the words. Her mind raced through possibilities. The window was too small to climb through. The door was the only way out, and 3 determined men stood between her and any chance of escape. Even if she could run, where would she go? They'd found her here, hundreds of miles from the last place she'd called home. They'd find her anywhere. Unless, the thought formed slowly, terrifyingly. What if she stopped running? What if she walked out that door and faced them directly, claimed her right to choose her own life and her son's future? What if she fought back instead of always fleeing? Mama! Benjamin's small hand touched her face. Are you crying? She realized. Silent tears that spoke of 3 years of shame and fear and endless, exhausting flight from judgment that followed her everywhere. But looking into her son's trusting eyes, Mercy felt something shift inside her chest. A hardening, like metal being forged in fire. No more running, baby, she whispered. Mama's done being afraid. She stood up, unlocked the door, and stepped into the main room where 4 men stood locked in a battle of wills that would determine the rest of her life. There she is, Reverend Whitfield announced with grim satisfaction as Mercy entered the room, Benjamin clinging to her skirts. Mercy Blackwood, you stand accused before God and this community of moral corruption, abandonment of Christian principles, and the willful endangerment of an innocent child. Mercy lifted her chin, meeting the Reverend's cold gaze directly. 3 months ago, those words would have sent her fleeing in shame. Today, standing in the home where she'd found acceptance and purpose, they felt like weapons that had lost their power to wound. I stand accused, she replied evenly, by men who've never walked in my shoes or faced my choices. The other 2 riders shifted uncomfortably. She recognized them now as deacons from the church back home, men who'd known her since childhood but now looked at her like something distasteful they'd found on their boots. Your choices led you here, Reverend Whitfield continued, his voice rising with practiced pulpit authority. Living in sin with a man of questionable character, exposing your child to moral decay, refusing to accept the righteous path offered by the church. Living in sin? Mercy's voice cracked like a whip. I've been working from dawn to dusk, tending a garden, caring for animals, making an honest living alongside a good man who's shown me nothing but respect and kindness. Unmarried cohabitation is fornication in the eyes of the Lord. The Lord, Jeremiah interrupted quietly, seems to have a different definition of sin than you do, Reverend. In my Bible, the sins are pride, judgment, and the hardness of heart that drives away people who need compassion. One of the deacons, a thin man Mercy remembered as particularly fond of pointing out other people's failings, stepped forward. You have no authority to speak on matters of Scripture, Cole. A man who lost his medical practice to drink has no moral standing to lecture his betters. The words hung in the air like poison, designed to shame Jeremiah into silence. But instead of the expected retreat, Mercy watched something remarkable happen. Jeremiah's shoulders straightened, his jaw set with quiet determination. You're right, he said simply. I did lose everything to drink. I made mistakes that hurt people who trusted me, and I paid the price for those choices. But that doesn't change what I see here. A woman working hard to build a good life for herself and her child, asking nothing from anyone except the chance to prove her worth through her actions. Her actions have already proven her worth, Reverend Whitfield snapped. She bore a child out of wedlock, abandoned her family's good name, and now corrupts others with her presence. Her actions, Jeremiah countered, have proven she's a loving mother, a skilled worker, and a woman of remarkable strength. If that's corruption, then I pray for more of it in this world. Mercy felt tears sting her eyes, but they weren't tears of shame this time. No one had ever defended her like this. Not her parents, not the man who'd promised to marry her, not the church that claimed to offer salvation. Only this broken doctor with gentle hands and a damaged past. Enough, the Reverend declared. We didn't ride 3 days to debate theology with a drunk and his whore. The boy comes with us, and the woman accepts her placement with the sisters. That's final. The ugly word, whore, fell between them like a thrown stone. Benjamin pressed closer to his mother's legs, sensing the hatred in the room even if he didn't understand its source. But Mercy no longer felt the familiar urge to run or hide or accept whatever punishment was being offered. Instead, she took a step forward, placing herself squarely between the men and her son. No, she said clearly. Benjamin stays with me and I stay here. If that makes me a sinner in your eyes, then I choose sin over your version of righteousness. You have no choice in the matter. The law, a new voice interrupted from the doorway, says a woman has the right to choose her own residence and occupation, provided she's not breaking any civil statutes. Everyone turned to see a weathered man in a marshal's badge leaning against the doorframe, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Marshal Pete Harrison. Mercy recognized him from the general store in town, though she'd never spoken to him directly. This is church business, Marshal, Reverend Whitfield said stiffly. Seems to me like it's become civil business the moment you started talking about taking children from their mothers. Marshal Harrison stepped fully into the room, his calm presence somehow filling the space. Got some interesting reports about men riding hard across the territory, making threats against residents who haven't broken any laws. The woman is morally unfit. The woman, the marshal said firmly, is a productive member of this community who pays her debts, causes no trouble, and raises her child properly. Been getting nothing but good reports about the work she's doing here. Mercy blinked in surprise. Reports? Who had been reporting on her activities? And why would a marshal care about the daily life of one displaced woman? As if reading her thoughts, Marshal Harrison's eyes found hers. Turns out you've got more friends in these parts than you might expect, Mrs. Blackwood. Folks who appreciate seeing someone work hard and mind their own business. The title, Mrs. Blackwood, spoken with respect rather than mockery, sent warmth spreading through her chest. When had she last been addressed with such simple dignity? This is outrageous, Reverend Whitfield sputtered. Civil authority has no business interfering with moral instruction. Civil authority, Marshal Harrison replied, has every business protecting citizens from harassment, intimidation, and threats against their children. Now, I suggest you gentlemen mount up and head back where you came from before I decide this conversation constitutes disturbing the peace. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, for men representing different kinds of power measuring each other's resolve. But it was Benjamin who broke the tension, tugging on his mother's skirt and announcing in his clear child's voice, "Mama, are the mean men going away now? I want to feed the chickens." The innocent question somehow deflated the Reverend's righteous fury, reducing the grand moral crusade to what it really was, grown men frightening a small child in his own home. Even the deacons looked uncomfortable as they realized how their mission appeared to neutralize. "This isn't over," Reverend Whitfield said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Yes," Mercy replied, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "It is." The wedding dress was nothing like Mercy had dreamed of as a young girl. But then again, nothing about her life had turned out like those girlish dreams. She stood before the cracked mirror in Jeremiah's bedroom, adjusting the simple blue dress that Martha Henley had brought over that morning, the same Martha who'd ridden up with the other neighbors to defend them against the Reverend's threats. "You sure about this?" Martha asked, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the dress's worn fabric. "Marriage is serious business, especially when the whole county's watching to see if you'll make it work." 3 weeks had passed since Marshal Harrison had sent the church delegation packing, but the proposal had come just 2 days ago. Not romantic words under starlight, but a practical conversation over morning coffee while Benjamin played with the chickens outside. "Marry me," Jeremiah had said simply, setting down his cup with hands that barely trembled anymore. "Not for love, we're both too broken for fairy tales. But for partnership, for protection, for the chance to build something decent together." "Why?" she'd asked, though her heart was already saying yes. "Because I'm tired of being alone, and you're tired of running. Because that boy deserves a name that won't follow him with shame. Because sometimes the best things grow from practical soil rather than romantic dreams." Now, watching her reflection in the mirror, Mercy wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the smartest decision she'd ever attempted. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who'd fled from town to town. This woman had calloused hands from honest work, sun-touched skin from outdoor labor, and eyes that had learned to meet the world's gaze without flinching. "I'm sure," she told Martha, and meant it. The ceremony would take place in the yard behind the cabin, officiated by a traveling preacher who'd arrived that morning with questions in his eyes but acceptance in his manner. Word had spread somehow. Prairie communities had their own mysterious ways of communication, and neighbors had been arriving since dawn with covered dishes and curious expressions. Through the window, Mercy could see them gathering. Families she barely knew but who'd apparently decided her fate mattered to them. The Pattersons from the next section over, the Wheelers who ran the grain elevator, even young Tom Bradley who delivered mail when the circuit rider came through. "Jeremiah's nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm," Martha observed with amusement. "Saw him checking his pocket watch 6 times in the past 10 minutes. Man's got it bad, whether he admits it or not." Mercy felt her cheeks warm. She'd noticed the way Jeremiah looked at her lately, not with the calculating assessment she'd learned to expect from men, but with something gentler and more complicated. Respect, certainly. Affection, perhaps. And underneath it all, the careful hope of someone who'd been disappointed before but couldn't quite stop himself from trying again. "Mrs. Cole," she said experimentally, testing how the name felt on her tongue. "Mercy Cole. Has a nice ring to it." Martha's smile held approval mixed with something that might have been relief. "About time this territory got itself another decent family. Lord knows we need all the good people we can get." A knock on the door interrupted them. "Mama," Benjamin's voice called through the wood. "Papa Jeremiah says, are you ready? The preacher man is here, and there's cake." Papa Jeremiah. When had that started? Mercy couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when her son had begun referring to the gentle man as his father, but hearing it now sent warmth spreading through her chest like summer sunshine. "Coming, baby," she called back, taking one last look at herself in the mirror. The woman reflected there looked ready for whatever came next. Marriage, motherhood, the challenge of building a life worth defending. Outside, the gathered neighbors had arranged themselves in a rough semicircle around a makeshift altar, 2 sawhorses supporting a plank covered with Martha's best tablecloth. Wildflowers picked by the neighborhood children decorated the simple space, while someone had strung lanterns between the trees despite the afternoon sunshine. Jeremiah stood waiting beside the preacher, wearing his best shirt and the pants he'd carefully mended the night before. His hair was combed back with water, his boots polished to a shine that spoke of nervous energy channeled into purposeful activity. When he saw her approaching, his expression shifted from anxiety to something approaching wonder. "You look beautiful," he said quietly as she took her place beside him. "You look scared," she replied with gentle teasing. "Terrified," he admitted, "but the good kind of scared, the kind that means something important is about to happen." The preacher, a kind-faced man who'd introduced himself as Brother Matthews, opened his worn Bible and began the familiar words. But Mercy found herself focusing not on the ceremony but on the faces surrounding them. These people had chosen to witness this moment, to offer their blessing to a union between 2 people the wider world had written off as damaged goods. Young Sarah Patterson caught her eye and offered a shy smile. Old Mr. Wheeler nodded his approval when she glanced his way. Even the children seemed to understand they were witnessing something significant, standing quietly beside their parents instead of running wild as usual. Do you, Jeremiah Cole, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do. His voice carried across the yard with quiet conviction. And do you, Mercy Blackwood, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? This was it. The moment when she stopped being Mercy Blackwood, unwed mother, fallen woman, object of scandal and shame, and became Mercy Cole, wife and partner in building something good from whatever life had left them. I do, she said, her voice strong enough to reach the back of the gathering. The preacher smiled. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Kansas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jeremiah, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle, respectful, but it held the promise of deeper intimacy to come. When they separated, the gathered neighbors erupted in cheers and applause that sent the chickens into a frenzy of squawking protest. Benjamin appeared at their side, tugging on both their hands. Are we a real family now? He asked with the directness that only children possessed. We've been a real family for weeks, Jeremiah told him seriously. This just makes it official. As the celebration moved toward the tables laden with food, Mercy felt a sense of completion she'd never expected to find. Not the romantic fulfillment of girlish dreams, but something more solid and enduring. The satisfaction of two broken people choosing to be stronger together than they'd ever been apart. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed across the Cole homestead as Benjamin chased his baby sister through the expanded garden. Little Mary, barely 2 years old, shrieked with delight as she toddled between the bean rows with her brother in pursuit, her dark curls bouncing with each unsteady step. Careful with your sister, Mercy called from the porch where she sat shelling peas, though her tone held more amusement than concern. These were good problems, the kind that came from abundance rather than want. The homestead had grown along with their family. A proper addition extended the original cabin, providing separate bedrooms for the children and a larger kitchen that could accommodate the frequent visitors who'd made their place a regular stop. The garden had tripled in size, producing enough vegetables to feed the family and provide surplus for trading in town. Most remarkably, Jeremiah's medical practice had quietly resumed. It had started with emergency calls, a broken bone here, a difficult birth there, situations where desperate people cared more about competent hands than past mistakes. Word had spread through the network of prairie families that Dr. Cole was back in business, and gradually his reputation had rebuilt itself on a foundation of successful treatments and reasonable fees. Mercy! Martha Henley's voice carried across the yard as she approached from the direction of town, her horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. You need to hear the news from back east. The urgent tone made Mercy set aside her peas and stand up quickly. In 5 years of friendship, she'd rarely seen Martha this excited about anything short of a barn fire or tornado warning. What news? Jeremiah emerged from the barn where he'd been treating a neighbor's ailing cow, his medical bag still in his hand. Letter came through on the mail circuit, Martha said, dismounting and pulling a folded paper from her riding jacket. From some fancy lawyer in Philadelphia. Says he's been looking for a Mrs. Mercy Blackwood on behalf of a client. The name hit like a physical blow. Mercy hadn't been called Blackwood in 5 years. Hadn't thought of herself by that name since the day she'd said, I do, in this very yard. But apparently the past had found her again. What kind of lawyer? Jeremiah asked, moving protectively closer to his wife. The expensive kind, from the sound of it. Says his client has information about Benjamin's father. Information that might be financially beneficial to the boy's future. Mercy felt the blood drain from her face. Benjamin's biological father, the man who'd promised marriage and delivered abandonment, who'd chosen his wealthy wife over the woman carrying his child. She'd spent years trying to forget him, building a new life where his shadow couldn't reach. What's that mean? Benjamin had stopped chasing Mary and now stood listening with the sharp intelligence he'd inherited from both his parents. At 8 years old, he knew he had a different father somewhere in the world, but Jeremiah was the only papa he'd ever known or wanted. It means, Jeremiah said carefully, that sometimes the past tries to write itself into the present, but that doesn't mean we have to let it. Martha looked between them with growing understanding. The lawyer wants to arrange a meeting. Says his client is prepared to make substantial provisions for the boy's education and future, provided certain conditions are met. What conditions? Mercy's voice came out sharper than she intended. Meeting in person, documentation of parentage, and Martha hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the next part. Relocation to a more suitable environment for raising a child of prominent lineage. The words hung in the air like a threat. After 5 years of peace, of building something good and solid, the world was once again trying to tear apart everything they'd created. But this time felt different. Not the shame-driven flight of her younger years, but a calculated assault designed to steal her son in the name of providing him advantages. They want to take him away, she said flatly. They want to buy him, Jeremiah corrected grimly. Dress it up in fancy language about education and opportunities, but what they're really offering is money in exchange for a child. Mary toddled over and wrapped her small arms around her mother's legs, sensing the tension even if she couldn't understand its source. Benjamin moved to stand beside Jeremiah, his young face set with determination that reminded Mercy powerfully of the man who'd raised him. I don't want to go anywhere, Benjamin announced with 8-year-old certainty. This is my home. These are my people. That other man, he's nothing to me. The simple declaration brought tears to Mercy's eyes. Her son, their son, had grown up secure in his place in the world, confident in his family's love, unburdened by the shame that had once defined her existence. The boy the lawyer's client wanted to claim was nothing like the child standing in their yard. Letter says they'll be passing through on the westbound stage next week, Martha continued. Expects you to be available for discussions. Expects, Jeremiah repeated with dangerous quiet. Interesting choice of words. Mercy looked around at everything they'd built. The expanded cabin, the thriving garden, the neighbors who'd become extended family, the children who'd never known a day of want or shame. 5 years ago, she would have run. 5 years ago, she would have believed she had no choice but to accept whatever powerful men decided was best. But 5 years had taught her the difference between being broken and being beaten. She'd learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons or words, but with the simple refusal to surrender what mattered most. When they come, she said quietly, they'll find we're not the same people they're expecting to intimidate. No, Jeremiah agreed, his hand finding hers. They won't be. As the sun set over their peaceful homestead, painting the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Cole family stood together facing the promise of another storm. But this time they wouldn't weather it alone. They'd meet whatever came next with the strength that came from belonging somewhere, to someone, in ways that no amount of money or legal maneuvering could break. The past might be coming to call, but it would find the present well defended. The fancy carriage looked as out of place on the prairie road as a peacock in a chicken coop, its polished black paint and brass fittings gleaming in the afternoon sun. Mercy watched it approach from the kitchen window, her hand steady as she kneaded bread dough despite the storm brewing in her chest. She'd been expecting this moment for a week, but seeing it arrive still felt like watching her own execution approach. Benjamin, she called without turning from the window. Take Mary to the Hendersons' place. Tell them we'll collect you both after supper. But Mama, no arguments. Her voice carried the authority of a mother who'd learned to protect what mattered most. This conversation isn't for children's ears. Through the glass, she could see Jeremiah emerging from the barn, his medical bag in one hand and his rifle in the other. Not brandishing the weapon, just letting it rest against his shoulder in a way that suggested competence rather than threat. After 5 years of marriage, she knew his moods well enough to recognize the careful calm that meant he was prepared for trouble. The carriage pulled to a stop in their front yard, looking absurdly elegant beside their practical wagon and farming tools. A uniformed driver remained on his seat while 2 men stepped down, one elderly and distinguished in an expensive suit, the other younger and somehow familiar despite the years that had passed. Mercy's breath caught as she recognized the second man. Richard Pemberton, Benjamin's biological father. The man who'd promised her marriage and delivered abandonment. Who'd sworn his love while already planning his return to Philadelphia and a socially acceptable bride. He looked older, softer around the middle, with the kind of well-fed appearance that spoke of comfortable living. His clothes were perfectly tailored, his shoes polished to mirror brightness. Everything about him screamed money and privilege, the very things she'd once thought would make her happy. Mrs. Cole. The elderly man spoke first as Mercy emerged from the house, her spine straight and her chin raised. I am Harrison Pemberton, Richard's father. We've come to discuss arrangements regarding my grandson. Grandson. The word fell between them like a claim of ownership, reducing Benjamin to a possession rather than a beloved child with his own thoughts and feelings. Mr. Pemberton. Mercy's voice remained level. You've wasted a long journey. There are no arrangements to discuss. Richard stepped forward, and she saw in his eyes the same weak charm that had once made her believe his promises. Mercy, you look... well, frontier life seems to agree with you. The casual familiarity, the assumption that years of abandonment could be brushed aside with smooth words, made her want to slap him. Instead, she smiled with deadly politeness. Mr. Pemberton, I wasn't expecting to see you again. Ever. Jeremiah joined them in the yard, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. He didn't speak, just stood close enough to offer support without appearing possessive. The contrast between the two men was striking. One soft from easy living, the other hardened by honest work and genuine struggle. Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside? Harrison Pemberton suggested, eyeing Jeremiah with obvious distaste. Family matters require privacy. We're not family, Mercy replied firmly. We stopped being family the day your son chose money over love and left me to face the consequences alone. Nevertheless, the elder Pemberton continued as if she hadn't spoken, blood creates obligations that transcend personal feelings. The boy is a Pemberton, heir to a considerable fortune. He deserves opportunities that this environment cannot provide. This environment, Jeremiah said quietly, has provided him with love, stability, education, and a clear sense of right and wrong. What exactly are you offering that's better than that? Richard's laugh held the condescending tone of someone addressing children. Really, Mercy? A frontier doctor and a woman of questionable reputation? Surely you can see that Benjamin deserves better than this rustic existence. The insult hung in the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Mercy felt Jeremiah tense beside her, but her own anger burned cold and focused. These men had arrived expecting to find the same frightened girl who'd once begged for Richard's love. Instead, they'd found a woman who'd learned her own worth through hard work and genuine affection. What Benjamin deserves, she said with deadly calm, is parents who chose him every single day for 8 years. Parents who stayed up nights when he was sick, who taught him to read and ride and treat all people with respect regardless of their station. What he doesn't deserve is to be uprooted from everything he knows to satisfy the guilt of a man who abandoned him before he was born. Guilt? Richard's face flushed. I'm offering the boy wealth, education, social position. You're offering to buy a child you never wanted because your father finally found out about your youthful indiscretions. Jeremiah interrupted with surgical precision. Must be embarrassing, having your mistakes surface just when you're trying to establish yourself in Philadelphia society. The hit landed with visible impact. Richard's composure cracked, revealing the petulant man-child beneath the polished exterior. You have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I? Jeremiah's smile held no warmth. Rich man's son gets a girl pregnant, promises marriage, then disappears when daddy threatens to cut off the money. Tale as old as time. The only question is why you're back now. Harrison Pemberton cleared his throat, reasserting control. My son's motives are irrelevant. The boy is a Pemberton heir, and he will be raised as such. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for your efforts in caring for him thus far. Compensation. Mercy repeated the word like it tasted foul. You want to pay me for raising my own son. Our son, Richard corrected weakly. No. The word came out with absolute finality. Jeremiah is his father. You're just a stranger who shares some blood. Through the kitchen window, she could see neighbors beginning to gather. Word traveled fast on the prairie, and the sight of a fancy carriage at the Cole place had obviously attracted attention. Martha Henley's familiar figure appeared at the garden gate, followed by the Pattersons and young Tom Bradley. Within minutes, a small crowd had assembled, their presence both curious and protective. Harrison Pemberton noticed the gathering with obvious displeasure. This is becoming a spectacle. Perhaps we should discuss terms more privately. There are no terms to discuss, Mercy said firmly. Benjamin stays with his family. End of conversation. I'm afraid it's not that simple. The older man's voice hardened. We have legal options if you prove unreasonable. Kidnapping charges against the man masquerading as the boy's father, for instance. Or questions about the fitness of parents who would deny a child his rightful inheritance. The threat hung between them like a drawn blade. Around the yard, neighbors moved closer, their faces showing the particular expression that prairie communities wore when outsiders threatened one of their own. Legal options, Marshall Harrison repeated as he stepped out of the growing crowd, his badge catching the afternoon sun. Interesting phrase. Care to elaborate on exactly which laws you think have been broken here? The arrival of law enforcement clearly wasn't part of the Pembertons' plan. Father and son exchanged glances that spoke of expensive lawyers and political connections, but also of uncertainty about how far their influence extended into the Kansas territory. This is a family matter, Harrison said stiffly. Funny thing about family matters, the marshal replied conversationally. They stop being private when they involve threats against my citizens. As the confrontation escalated, Mercy realized this was about more than just Benjamin. This was about two different visions of what family meant, one based on blood and money and social obligation, the other built on choice and commitment and daily acts of love. The outcome would determine not just her son's future, but the kind of world he'd grow up believing in. 20 years later, Dr. Benjamin Cole stood on the porch of his childhood home, watching his own children chase chickens through the same yard where he'd once played. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light. The expanded house, the thriving garden, the barn where his stepfather still treated sick animals despite being well into his 70s. Papa Ben. Papa Ben. His daughter Sarah came running up the steps, her dress muddy from playing in the creek. Grandpa Jeremiah says you used to live in a big fancy house with servants and everything, but you chose to stay here instead. Is that true? Benjamin smiled, lifting the 6-year-old onto his lap. The story had become family legend over the years, told and retold at gatherings until it had taken on the weight of myth. But at its heart lay a simple truth about the difference between where you came from and where you chose to belong. It's true, he said, smoothing her tangled hair. Some people thought I should go live with my birth father in Philadelphia. But I knew this was my real home. Why? She asked with the directness that all children possessed. Because home isn't about big houses or fancy things. It's about people who love you even when you're difficult, who stay up with you when you're sick, who teach you the difference between right and wrong. Your grandparents gave me all of that. Through the kitchen window, he could see his mother, now Mercy Cole for longer than she'd ever been Mercy Blackwood, preparing supper with the same efficient grace she'd shown throughout his childhood. At 72, she moved a bit slower, but her hands remained steady and her eyes still held the determined spirit that had carried her through those early years of struggle. Tell me again about the mean men who wanted to take you away, Sarah demanded, settling more comfortably against his chest. It was her favorite story, though Benjamin sometimes wondered if she understood how close they'd all come to losing everything. The legal battle had dragged on for months, with lawyers and judges and endless paperwork that had threatened to tear their family apart through sheer bureaucratic force. Well, he began, launching into the familiar tale. There were these two men in a fancy carriage who thought they could buy anything they wanted, including little boys who didn't want to be bought. The Pembertons had underestimated the power of a community that had decided to protect its own. Neighbors had testified about Benjamin's happiness and the Cole family's good character. Local officials had questioned the motives of wealthy Easterners trying to steal children from loving homes. Most importantly, Benjamin himself had been allowed to speak, an 8-year-old boy telling a judge with perfect clarity that he knew exactly where he belonged. And then what happened? Sarah prompted, though she knew every word of the story. Then the judge said I could choose for myself where I wanted to live. And I chose to stay right here with Mama and Papa Jeremiah and all our neighbors who'd become like family. The legal victory had come with an unexpected twist. Richard Pemberton, perhaps motivated by guilt or genuine affection, had established a trust fund for Benjamin's education, money that had paid for medical school and allowed him to return to the community that had raised him as their own doctor. Did the mean men ever come back? No, sweetheart. They learned that some things can't be bought or stolen or taken away by force. Love is like that, it only grows when it's freely given. As evening settled over the homestead, 3 generations of the Cole family gathered around the dinner table. Jeremiah, now silver-haired but still sharp-eyed, said grace with the same gentle authority he'd shown throughout Benjamin's childhood. Mercy served food grown in their own garden, canned by her own hands, shared with children and grandchildren who'd never known a day of want or shame. Benjamin looked around the table, at his wife Rebecca, whom he'd met at medical college, at their 3 children, who took for granted the security he'd fought to keep, at the parents who'd chosen love over biology and made it work through decades of daily commitment. You're thinking loud again, Jeremiah observed with a smile that hadn't changed in 20 years. Just grateful, Benjamin replied. For all of it. The struggles, the victories, the ordinary days that turned into an extraordinary life. Later that evening, as the family settled on the front porch to watch the sunset paint the Kansas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah climbed onto her grandmother's lap. Grandma Mercy, she said seriously, when I grow up, I want to be brave like you. Mercy's laugh held the music of years lived fully despite hardship. Oh, sweetheart, I wasn't brave. I was just too stubborn to give up on the people I loved. Same thing, Sarah declared with 6-year-old wisdom. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Benjamin reflected on the strange turns that had brought them all to this moment. A broken doctor and a cast-out woman had found each other on an empty prairie road, built something good from whatever materials life had left them, and created a legacy that would ripple forward through generations. The horseman's heart had indeed proved strong enough to shelter not just one family, but an entire community's understanding of what it meant to choose love over judgment, commitment over convenience, the daily work of caring over the easy path of abandonment. Some stories, Benjamin realized, didn't end so much as continue, passing from one generation to the next like heirloom seeds, growing stronger with each planting. In the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome song to the prairie moon. But here on the Cole homestead, surrounded by the warm glow of lantern light and the soft murmur of family conversation, the sound held no threat, only the wild music of a land that had learned to make room for love in all its forms. The broken had become whole, the cast out had found their home, and the horseman's heart beat on, steady and true, in the lives of all those it had sheltered along the way.